Hello and welcome to the Planning Podcast from Number 5 Chambers. I'm Richard Kimblin and I'm joined today by Satnam Choongh, Catriona Riddell, Dave Valler and Daniel Francis. Dave from Oxford Brookes University and Daniel Francis from Jonas. Satnam Choongh you'll know from Chambers and Catriona Riddell needs no introduction. I'm not going to spend long introducing the Oxford-Cambridge arc. It's not entirely obvious what it is. That's one of the things that we explore. We're just going to get straight stuck into this most fascinating area, dynamic, wonderfully difficult in terms of the variety of governance structures which have to be dealt with to deliver new train lines, the demise of an expressway. There's so much going on. Let's hear what they have to say. Good morning, Catriona. How are you?
Morning, I'm absolutely fine, thank you.
I saw that you were out and about in a real office yesterday.
I was, yeah. First trip out since March 2020, which was a bit surreal. Empty train station, no empty trains, very quiet tubes, so it was all good.
Well, we need people back on the train so they're listening to podcasts.
Yep.
But and how are you, Dave? How are you?
Fine. Thanks. Thanks for having me as well amongst these esteemed colleagues. So nice to be here.
Lovely to see you. And Satnam Choongh, good morning to you.
Good morning, Richard. How are you?
All the better for being with you and for having people who can explain this most complicated web of issues which arises from the space called the arc. I don't believe it's an arc, actually. I think it's a triangle. But we're going to have a look at the arc. And I just mapped out just how simple and straightforward our podcast is going to be, because it seemed to me there were 6 tiny little problems to tangle with. There's the concept of infrastructure planning. Secondly, across a number of local government regions, which we have to get to cooperate. Thirdly, that the government wants to take part as well via direct intervention in forward planning, novel for this government. Fourthly, all that we then have to do is wonder how we integrate any spatial planning framework into Section 38.6 so it has any teeth in the development plan. Once you've got past those 4 tiny issues, all we have to deal with then is meeting housing need and sorting out affordability. And once you've sorted out housing need and affordability, just cross-check that you've kept the environment intact, principally the spatial protections associated with Greenbelt, AONB, habitats and heritage. And once you've sorted out those 6 things, you've nailed down the progress of the arc. Isn't it that straightforward?
That's very straightforward. That sounds like about a day's work to me. It should be fine.
Yeah. So, Catriona, do you want to just outline just how we sort that out?
In 5 minutes. Well, I mean, first of all, can I just say that, this is the first proper strategic planning we've had coming back in 11 years. So hurrah, this is great. This is a new beginning, and we'll wait to see what the government does further in terms of strategic planning and the planning reforms. But the arc as a concept in different guises has been around for such a long time. I mean, it was the Golden Arc, which was really London, Cambridge, Oxford, built around the universities and the sort of spin-off from there. But from a spatial planning perspective, it's an interesting one because Cambridge and Oxford have never been in the same sort of spatial planning geography before. I think the closest we ever got to it was when we had, as we affectionately called it, the MKSM, which was Milton Keynes South Midlands, which was where 3 regional strategies joined. So we had the South East, East of England and the East Midlands regional strategies, and that area was sort of planned in a much more integrated way. And one of the questions I think that's being asked is it a coherent spatial planning geography? And the National Infrastructure Commission, who kicked this all up this time round, sort of said it was. But I think the interesting thing from their perspective is I think they were very much seeing it as being an area joined up by a nice big expressway and with some new settlements along the arc. And of course, we know now that has fallen away. So what makes the arc the arc? And I think that's where the government's going to have to try and sort of reinvent or invent some sort of spatial coherency. And with their East-West Rail does that. We have got spatial geography has always been heavily influenced by national government decisions. So new towns, train lines, motorways. These have all been probably the biggest influences on where people live and work in history. So if the government's going to put its money into this area and put in some really big interventions like investing in East-West Rail and providing sort of some new communities along the way, then that probably will provide us in the long term with some sort of spatial sort of coherency. So, it's all down to the government and the investment that goes into it and the level of public sector investment that goes into it to sort of make it work.
Well, can I just see where we are with that? Because Expressway, now not quite so express, grant chaps came to the conclusion in March that didn't pay its way, and so the expressway was scrapped. But East-West Rail continues to trundle along via a number of inquiries, putting together different sections of the East-West Rail route. I think we're still awaiting the outcome of the last inquiry, but it seems as though East-West Rail still is a favoured project, and that is part of what you're mentioning there as part of the skeleton of a spatial framework.
Yeah, and one of the reasons that the area never really worked in that relationship, particularly between sort of Oxford and Cambridge, was because the connectivity east-west was never good. It was always radial into London. So Oxford always had a good connectivity with Milton Keynes, but Cambridge had nothing really to do with Oxford. So I think the government's rationale is if we improve the physical connectivity across that area, it will improve how it functions economically. And again, we'll wait and see if that is the case. But the most, I think for Oxford and Cambridge and some other areas, it's the areas beyond that boundary that are going to matter economically. So for Oxfordshire, relationships with places like Reading and Swindon are even more important to them than it is to Cambridge, and Cambridge with West Suffolk. So, as long as the ARC remains an area with very fuzzy boundaries, then I think, we have some potential for it to work as a sort of spatial geography in future with East-West Rail investment. And I think that's important. It has to invest in the sort of the railway in the way that it does, the way that the government's committed to.
Do you think, or does anybody think that then is the rate determining step, that the speed with which East-West Rail can come forward, if that's fundamental and there is no longer an expressway, are we looking at something which is quite long term?
For me, it's about I think whatever way you look at it, it's long term because, I think National Infrastructure Commission suggested we have 5 new towns or 5 new communities or something like that along the way. And I'm really pleased to see that, it's that whole this is a place to plonk a whole lot of housing debate has gone away in the government, and I think with an awful lot of push from the local authorities and others has moved much more into the green art concept, about it being about a real sort of the jewel in the crown in terms of UK PLC and the sort of future green economy. And I think that's great, but again, that will need a huge amount of investment. But it will also need a lot more housing. So the sort of the idea of having some new communities is great, but they are all long term. None of this, other than what's already planned in the local planning areas, is going to be short term solution.
Both Satnam and I have spent lots of time in local authority buildings in ARC local authorities. One thinks immediately of Aylesbury. And the general sense I've got from weeks sitting in those rooms is that local people and indeed neighbourhood plans take a slightly different view. I don't know if you picked up the same sentiment, Satnam?
Well, what I was going to say was that generally speaking, in especially local plan examinations or even Section 78 inquiries, the way that the ARC concept comes into the debate is normally by developers pointing to the ARC concept to justify greater housing numbers, an uplift in housing numbers, or a more pro-development attitude to a particular proposal. And because it's all packaged up as more housing, meaning more housing, it's deeply unpopular. I mean, we know that development is unpopular in this country. New housing is unpopular wherever you go, wherever you try and put it. There's a pushback by local. We don't need any more housing. We've taken our fair share, etc. And I think one of the biggest problems with the ARC concept is that it's managed to get itself a very sort of negative profile amongst the communities who are going to be affected. They just see it as a sort of a Trojan horse through which they're going to have huge amounts of housing dumped on them, to which they're resistant. And I'd be interested to hear people's views as to how the government's going to turn that mindset around, especially in an era of localism. We were told by this government, and before that the coalition government, that they believed in localism, so they believe in local buy-in, and yet here they are pushing a concept which they don't really seem to have done a great deal of work on, in terms of getting the communities that are going to be affected to believe or agree that there are huge benefits for them.
So one of the, sorry, Dave.
Sorry, I really do think this is the absolute key issue, though. Housing. Reflecting on this over the last few days, I was trying to think. Basically, why do we need the Arc? Why do we need this area? I do think that the primary rationale for for development in the Arc is to face up to the structural housing crisis in London and the wider southeast. If you look at the scale of housing that's going to be required in London, under the new standard housing formula and the urban uplift, we're looking, at requirements of 90,000 houses in London per year. They've only been providing less than 40,000. So London has massive structural housing problems. Oxford and Cambridge housing affordability is impossible. And in order to face up to this housing crisis in the greater southeast of England, where do we provide houses? What are the options? And if we're not going to allow much building on the green belt, if we're going to protect our most important green spaces, then you end up probably with the Oxford Cambridge Arc as being an area that has really significant potential in it, and where development can come forward on a scale which is realistic to make a significant contribution to the housing needs of the area, and especially in terms of affordability. There aren't that many options in the southeast of England, the greater southeast. So I really, really do think that housing is the absolute core of the issue here, but it requires political leadership. It requires national political leadership to say we must face up to this housing crisis. We continually hear the numbers of 300,000 houses a year required, but it requires national political leaders to come out and say, well, look, here is a location which is appropriate to develop houses and help us respond and provide houses in places where people really want to live.
Well, it hasn't been lost on me that we're recording this on May the 6th, when excursions to COVID-secure polling stations are taking place. And you don't have to spend very long on social media to see that development and planning are in fact prominent local issues. And really what both Satnam and Dave seem to be highlighting there is the tension between the need and the local pushback, and the tension between what Catriona has referred to in terms of the government intervention in real spatial planning across something which we might call a region, tension between that and localism. And Catriona, I think you were going to say something further just then. What was that?
Yeah, I mean, to that point, first of all, I think the point about the Arc being the solution to the wider southeast, there is another solution, and that's the Thames Estuary, and we can come to that later if you want, because I think that is the only other place the government probably will have some appetite to do something similar in. But in terms of localism, when the strategic planning in the form of regional strategies was abolished in the Localism Act, what they did was they put all the risk, both the political risk and the investment risk, the financial risk, to the local level, right down to the most local level. And before that, and there's been a lot said about the planning reforms, about the government's proposal to basically give local authorities their housing number. Until 2011, that is how it happened. That is what the government has always allocated local plans, the housing number, up until 2011. And the way they did that was through regional spatial strategies. Now, although regional assemblies got the blame for them, they were adopted by the government and they were government policy. It was a government document. And before that, we had regional planning guidance, which again was government documents, and it set the housing numbers for the structure plans. So the government up in history, even before that, has always set the allocations for housing. And what happened when it did that was, it took the risk out of that sort of local level and a lot of the financial risk because of the investment it had to put behind its regional priorities. But it also introduced the blame. It had a really clear blame game. And when Eric Pickles came in and introduced the Localism Act, he said, you know, we're going to get rid of the blame game. We're all going to be locally accountable for the decision making. And where has that got us? Because what the blame game did, and I always use my experience in Surrey as a really good example. Surrey, when I was in charge of the structure plan, the number of housing for the structure plan was given by RPG 9, which was government policy. So the county council could blame the government for its number, but get on then and divvy it up amongst 11 districts. The 11 districts could then blame the county council and say, oh, nasty county council gave us our housing number. But then what happened, and this is the magic, the reality was the relationship at that local level was extremely positive because there was no fight around the numbers. So the districts could then go on and plan really positively with the local communities about what the shape would look like, how it would work actually on the ground. And of course there was local fights around specific sites and things like that, but a lot of the heat was taken out of it because we had that blame game and we had a proper strategic planning system that collectively shared the blame and the responsibility for making really difficult political, but also really difficult financial decisions. And what the government has done is they've basically modelled it on RPGs, regional planning guidance. They've introduced a system in the ARC where they've said, okay, it's not part of the statutory planning system like regional spatial strategies were, which I personally think was a mistake. It took it too far. So we said we've taken that bit out of it, but it is going to have the stamp of government policy. So it is going to have to impact directly on your local plans, and it is going to dictate a certain amount at the strategic level of your local plans. But in that way, we're going to allow you, then release you to work much more practically and positively with your local communities around shaping that. And people might say that is pie in the sky, and that's a dream version, a magical version of how planning works. But that is how it worked in reality right up until 2011.
So, Dave, is there an alternative way of approaching this? Is it just RPG or RSS? Is there some consultation approach? What alternatives have you been thinking about?
I think perhaps there is an alternative way of approaching this. From my point of view, I think the weakest element of the approach towards the ARC as a whole over 20 plus years now has been the lack of reaching out to the public and the constitution of a public debate over what the ARC actually is and what its underlying rationale is and what might be realistic in terms of proposals for the ARC and the scale of development and the kind of spatial strategy that might be brought forward. So my sense is that there's a role for central government in pulling together a public debate and providing leadership there and setting out the issues and facing up to the fact that there is really powerful opposition out there, which has mobilized already and which has already demonstrated its power with the debate around the with the expressway being removed. I think politicians find it very difficult at the moment to provide leadership around the ARC because they expose themselves to a lot of criticism immediately. So I do think there's a role for something like a citizens' assembly where we would pull together a sharp period, maybe 6 months or so, or a year maximum, of quite intense debate around the nature of the arc and why it might be required, what it's actually facing up to, what its potential scale might be. At least giving people a chance to air the issues and for them to be heard. Then we provide a basis upon which strategic options can be brought forward, really. But to date, I do think that public engagement has been handled very badly. And that's one of the reasons why the level of opposition has been quite dramatic.
So, Catriona, what's happening on the ground amongst local authorities across the Arc? Are they doing anything? Is there a growth board? What's the present situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the points I would make, though, is the question that's being asked, right back to my point at the start. It's not what is the Arc, it's what could the Arc be. And I think, things like the Thames Valley never existed before the M4. They're, big investment, national government investment shapes spatial planning geography and makes them a coherent area for planning. And I think the question that the government and everybody should be asking is, what could this area be in terms of the local area, in terms of its impact? How could we do something really special here? And what is its benefit nationally in terms of the global economy, its contribution to the global economy? And these are big, big questions that the government needs to ask. But I think in terms of what happens on the ground, the local authorities can't walk away from this because they've got an agreement. They've sort of set up a leaders group now. All the leaders are working together, and I think it's a shame, personally, that the leader of Buckinghamshire, for example, has walked away, because Buckinghamshire's still there. It just means they haven't got a voice now because they're outside the tent rather than inside the tent. So, whether that's political or not,
I suppose that was a sort of Buxit, really, wasn't it?
Yes, it was, and the point is, it wasn't going to go away because Buckinghamshire walked away. It's still very much there, and it's still going to move forward as long as this government is driving it. So you have the Oxfordshire Growth Board, which has been very proactive in terms of its growth deal, its housing growth deal, and in terms of its joint planning framework. And at the other end, you have the Combined Authority, the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Combined Authority, which has probably been less proactive in terms of its long-term strategic planning. And then you've got all the bits in the middle. And you've got some, and I think one of the reasons the government sort of wants to do it in a more with this high-level framework is to make it a little bit more sensible as a geography. And again, back to the point about it being connected a lot better in terms of, so it's supporting the economy with new housing and other things like the East-West Railway, but it's also about just making it a better connected area. People will be able to move better between areas. And I think the role of that has to be in terms of the engagement. And Dave's absolutely right. There is a really important role with local communities in that engagement aspect. But if I look back to the way regional spatial strategies worked when I was responsible for the South East Plan, and we as an assembly never did that engagement, we relied 100% really. I mean, of course, we asked some of the big questions, but the bulk of the really good, strong evidence came from the local authorities who were engaging directly with their local communities. They knew their communities better. They had the established relationships. So there was no point in the Regional Assembly having these conversations when they were going to get a much richer response with the local authorities doing it on our behalf. And I think that has to be the same approach across the Arc. Whilst the government needs to ask some of the big questions around its future economy, its role in levelling up and things like that, I think in terms of the impact on the ground, there has to be a much more direct conversation between the local authorities on the ground and the local communities. And they can't abdicate responsibility for that. Even if they don't like it, even if they're against it, they still have a responsibility to make sure their local communities have a say. And that will only happen if they proactively engage with their local communities and ask the right questions. So yes, there will be lots and lots of campaign groups fighting against this. That's inevitable. It's always the case. But there's an awful lot of people that probably will have a different view. And that, that is so important that the local communities tap into that engagement side of things and inform the spatial framework on the government's behalf. The government can't do an engagement process just at that level, that won't work.
Sat, you had some experience of local engagement, having done what I refer to as the SODC TV event,
Yes.
essentially the first examination done virtually.
Now, I particularly enjoyed Catriona's description of how the RSS worked, and in particular the blame game. And I almost sort of, it reminded me of sort of, it was Wall Street's equivalent, doesn't it? Wall Street, they say that greed is good. And I think Catriona just made an argument for saying that in planning, blame is good, because everyone was able to blame everyone else, but the job got done. And I think there is lessons to be learned from that in terms of this ARC concept and how it's going to work, if it's going to work at all. Ultimately, I think that if things are going to work, politicians have to accept that they have to take decisions, and some of those decisions will be unpopular and that they will be blamed for them. But I think that's what leadership is about. And at the moment, I just get the impression that nobody wants to take the tough decisions because they don't want to take the blame. They simply want it to be popular. It's not possible to take difficult decisions and be popular. If they're the right decisions, people probably won't see the benefit of them, probably for decades, by which time you've been blamed and chucked out of office. And I think that is the central stumbling block to getting anything done. If you look at South Oxfordshire, for example, it has the Oxfordshire Growth Board, as Catriona has said, but also in terms of concrete things happening, there was the Oxfordshire Housing and Growth Deal. So that the government put a lot of money on the table, and that money was specific to certain projects. And I think that rather than having this rather vague concept of the ARC, which if you say, well, what is it? What is the ARC? I mean, it's probably the lawyer in me always wants to say, what do you mean? What is your point? And if you say, well, what does it mean? Tangibly, what does it mean? Well, it meant the expressway. Now we know it means half the expressway. And once that's taken away, what is left is east-west rail. Would we not be better off taking the South, or would the government not be better off taking the South Oxfordshire example and saying on a council by council basis, on a local planning authority by local planning authority basis, look, we will give you X million pounds, and these are the infrastructure projects we expect to see in your area. So here's the money, but it comes with strings attached. For that money, you must deliver the following roads, the following infrastructure, and you must sign up to delivering X number of houses. Now, ultimately, that is what swung it at South Oxfordshire Council in terms of them voting their plan through. It was a combination of that and the Secretary of State saying, if you don't vote for it, I'll impose it on you anyway. And maybe that's what we need. That what we do need is, what was it Eric Pickles eventually called it? Muscular localism. Maybe that's what we need to go back to and think about.
Well, Satnam, maybe if the Secretary of State was on the call, and perhaps one day we'll engineer that, the Secretary of State would say, well, it's most unfair to criticise politicians for not making the difficult decisions. I intervened. I used the powers available to me in South Oxfordshire, took the perhaps unpopular step of saying, you will adopt a plan, and insisted that that was so. And so didn't he, in fact, do what you said they weren't?
Oh, I agree, is that an example of what we should see more of? Maybe that was the first example, just like Catriona says that the spatial strategy for the ARC may be the first sign of regional planning. So it's a combination of the two. I mean, politicians will never admit that they were wrong, that the abolition of regional planning, strategic planning was wrong. They're never going to say that, but they will do it in baby steps. And maybe the spatial strategy for the ARC area is the first baby step back to where we should always have been.
So if I'm somebody who either wants to bring forward development because I'm a landowner, or somebody who wants to bring forward development because I have a business which is concerned with the building of houses, I'm a house builder, would I prefer your option, Satnam? Government provide the necessary incentive and back it up with firm action from the Secretary of State? Or do I want to be waiting at the site of a future railway station, waiting for the train to arrive?
Now, what do you think, Dave?
Yeah, I was just reflecting on the overall sort of governance picture, really. The Buckinghamshire thing is tricky. When you look at the overall picture, it's going to be very, very difficult to work across 23, 25 local authorities. Practically, how could it work? There might be scope to work through sort of 4 major growth boards, really. So I think it's Oxfordshire at one end, Bucks, the kind of central area, and Cambridgeshire, and have those 4 growth boards as the kind of key local voices. And then from central government level there'll be an ARC group as a whole, and perhaps that's some combination of the growth boards and central government politicians, and representatives. So perhaps there's a kind of overarching strategic body dealing with the picture as a whole, and then the 4 growth boards working underneath that. Okay, it's tricky at the moment with Buckinghamshire being reticent, but I guess there's further discussions to be had there at some point. Potentially that could work. At the moment, it is incredibly fragmented and messy, and local authorities are sort of very wary of stepping too far. There's a lot of unknowns and uncertainties, and they're just kind of in a holding pattern, just waiting to see what's going to happen next. Catriona might have further thoughts on this. Just as a kind of set of practical steps forward, I think that's probably where I would end up.
May I just ask, Dave, would you have the output from such growth boards being essentially a material consideration in planning decisions rather than part of the development plan, or would you have them producing something which is in fact an RSS? One perhaps injects a degree of legal force because you incorporate those policies into section 38.6 as part of the development plan and a requirement to have regard to them and make decisions in accordance with them. Or would you leave it as something slightly fuzzier and much more of the sort of RPG style of output? Which would you prefer?
That is a very difficult question to answer. Probably the latter. I'm not sure we have the kind of regional institutional architecture in place to achieve the former. So it may be that something slightly looser, which goes as far as it can to shape the sort of regional direction. Maybe that's as much as we can achieve. It's difficult to say, though, trying to guess forwards that far, really.
This is the nub of the issue, is that sort of governance structure. And I've always said, whatever basis you have for strategic planning, if you don't get the decision making right, it won't work. Because, strategic planning is essentially making decisions in the interests of the greater good. That's what its purpose is. And that's why that sort of blame game worked with it. But it is also really important that this is about collective leadership. And the reason, I wasn't in the room to listen to the discussions, but I highly suspect the reason South Oxfordshire pulled into line wasn't just the fact that they were told they've got a huge amount of money already invested in South Oxfordshire. It was because the other partners across Oxfordshire said, hey, hang on, we've all agreed up to this, whether you don't like it or not, and whether you've changed governance structure or not, this is what South Oxfordshire is going to do. And it was that sort of collective leadership. It was that sort of corralling behind something. And what Dave's described, with the 4 growth boards, is what, through County Council Network, we put forward a proposal to government very much around that it's growth boards that set a spatial framework, high-level spatial framework, an investment framework for their area, and that gets signed off by government as sort of the high-level framework for local plans, but also local transport plans and other plans and strategies which are important in the ARC, as well as just the development plans. But also, the most important thing is it becomes that contract between central and local government, which we've been missing for some time, and contract with government agencies. And probably one of the failings of the Oxfordshire model, which is now it's the opposite in the ARC, is that the Oxfordshire model, they agreed the money and they agreed the contract without the framework. So they're now doing the joint plan, but they agreed all that in advance of knowing what they were agreeing to, if you know what I mean. So they didn't know what the spatial strategy for Oxfordshire looked like. They agreed to do it through the joint plan as part of the deal, but they didn't know what the implications of that were. This time in the ARC, they're doing the spatial framework first, and then they sign off in terms of where the investment's going. So for that question you asked, Richard, about sort of the investment side, for investment confidence, you need strong collective leadership where it's not down to one individual partner, it's down to a partnership where the other partners are going to pull any strays back into line and say, look, this is our mutual benefits we're trying. This package is about mutual benefits, not about individual benefits, and we all need to take the rough with the smooth, and or the there's going to be winners and losers basically, and that isn't there. And the other thing is, so this is the leadership, that issue, collective leadership, and the other issue for me is that essential contract between central government and local government. And the deals that we've had up until now have all been about funding immediate priorities investment in the next 5 years. They've not been about long-term solutions. And to get to the long-term solutions, you need a spatial framework. You need to know what that looks like. And local communities, in order to engage with that, need to know what that looks like. So the ARC is trying to do it the right way round, but the local authorities have now a responsibility through that leadership group to show some really strong leadership and influence that as a collective rather than individuals, and take the mutual benefits for everyone, accepting that in doing that there are going to be winners and losers.
I'm quite interested, Richard, in the legal framework about how this is going to be delivered. We're going to have this spatial strategic framework. What is its role going to be? As soon as it's adopted, will it be part of the development plan across that entire area? So if you're in one of those 23 authorities, it's the local plan and the spatial strategic framework, which together comprise the development plan. Is that the model, or is it going to be simply like a sister document to the NPPF? So it's a material consideration at the plan making stage. Will there be some sort of legal requirement for individual development plans to be in general conformity with the spatial strategy? And it's those sort of things that I'm interested in, and to what extent will the spatial strategic framework talk about housing numbers and the distribution of housing numbers? Because if it's going to set an overarching housing requirement across the ARC, is it then going to go one step further and a bit like the RSS, distribute those numbers between the authorities? Because once it starts to do that, then you get into the arguments about, well, can this local planning authority accommodate that level of growth? Does it need to review its green belt? It's those sort of things that I'm quite interested in. How specific is it going to be? How is it going to? Now, I suppose I'm looking at it from sort of, a lawyer's point of view, turning up at a local plan examination and asking, how do I, what's the relationship here between the spatial strategic framework and this development plan in terms of what we should be saying to this particular plan inspector?
I know that Catriona has written a really incisive piece for the TCPA quite recently, in which she says, well, it's really rather analogous to the framework, having a spatial framework, which is a material consideration in development management decisions, and it ought to be something with which local plans are in accordance. I think that is what Catriona sees as the sort of architecture of this new document. Have I understood your position correctly?
Yeah, I mean, we had two systems of regional planning in the last sort of 30, 40 years. One was regional planning guidance, where it was national policy, but not part of the statutory development plan. So the statutory development plan were structure plans and the local plan sitting underneath that. And then we had regional spatial strategies and local plans, so they took away that sort of middle ground away. I've always said, even though I was obviously part of that sort of architecture, my view is that regional spatial strategies went too far in that they were supposed to be high level frameworks, but they were also part of the legal statutory development plan.
That was Eric Pickle's top-down imposition.
Yeah, and it was, and again, it was the critical issue for all of us, and this is the point, is that both RPGs and RSS were prepared with significant input from the local authorities to ensure that when they came out the other end, they were deliverable. So in RPG's case, in the southeast, we had SERPLAN, which we had all the local authorities, the county authorities mainly, because they were structure plan authorities, were the ones that presented the draft, which was then taken forward through examination by government and finally adopted by government as government policy. But it was very much informed by that bottom-up process. So it was that magic top-down, bottom-up process. RSS was the same, and we had what we called Section 4.4 authorities in the 2004 Act, which were the county and unitary authorities, and they had a legal responsibility to work with regional centres and government to inform the outcome of the RSS, and we had the sub-regional strategies as a result of that. They were also legally responsible for the consultation process as well, and that was written into legislation. And that's the sort of thing, I think, that the element that we're missing here, and that's my point about it's how proactive the local authorities want to be on this. You know, if the 4 growth boards want to develop their own framework of how they think this should evolve, and that gets taken into the mix, then they should do that. But if they spend their time just fighting this, and you know, I know from experience in things like Terminal 5 and things like that, you can have high level opposition, but be really proactive to mitigate for your area what the outcome is. You can't just spend your whole time saying, I'm not getting involved, I don't want this, which I think is what Buckinghamshire have opted to do, because then you have no influence over something that is going to happen. So I think that the model has to be informed, the framework has to be informed by local evidence as much as the sort of higher level evidence, and local input from the bottom up. And that's why, you know, the Oxfordshire model, I think there's a recognition by the local authorities and the growth board there, is that the quicker they get their plan into place, the quicker they will have influence on the outcome of the ARC. And I think that's a sensible approach to me. You know, they are responsible for their local communities, and they're responsible in terms of influencing the outcome of that spatial framework on behalf of their local communities. They can't abdicate that responsibility.
But have we come back to Dave's point, which he expressed earlier, that there is something of a deficit in terms of local engagement to inform the strategy in the first place? Is that the weakness we've come back to?
I think Dave's point was the government needs to do more. My point was it's not down to the government. It should be the local authorities should take responsibility for this.
Right, got it.
They shouldn't have to wait to be told what the government's engagement strategy is. They should be out there now engaging proactively with local communities around how this should shape up. Because if the government's going to stick to its timetable, we're going to see something by the summer.
Catriona, is it fair to say that your answer to the Buckinghamshire position, sort of the language that the leader used, was very reminiscent of basically going back to the Eric Pickles position, saying we will not have top-down planning. We won't have people from outside telling us what should happen in our area and what's good for us. And that's straight back to the tension, isn't it? Back to the tension between sort of top-down planning and localism. But it seems to me from what you're saying, your answer to that is that top-down planning may look like top-down planning when you end up with a spatial strategic framework, but actually that spatial strategic framework didn't emanate from the top. The top may have had an input into it, but the top, i.e. the government, the state, isn't the only body that's had an input into it. It should begin with input from each of the 23 local planning authorities. So when it comes out the other end, when you end up with a spatial strategic framework, it hasn't just landed from another planet to be imposed on the Buckinghamshires of this world. They have had the opportunity to inform it, so that when it comes out, there is at least some local buy-in. They may not have got everything that they wanted, but by engaging the process, they'll get some of what they wanted.
Yeah, and I think if you look back, I know this is a bit geeky, but I've done a couple of lectures recently on the wider southeast and sort of the history of regional planning. If you look back to the old first regional strategy in the mid-60s, which was the responsibility of the regional economic boards, you know, they've got a fantastic chapter there around implementation, and what it says is this is transformational. This will only work if local government and central government and all the agencies in between work together in an aligned strategy, and they all have agreed what that strategy is. They are all pointing in the same direction in terms of what they're trying to achieve. There will be arguments about how they get there, but the ultimate aim needs to be shared right across the board because of the significant scale of public expenditure going into these areas to transform them. So in managing the risk, unless central government and local government work together, then the investment confidence at that local level is going to be pretty poor, because developers want to know that this is going to happen and how it's going to play out. They don't want to take what the government's saying in the spatial arc and then have to fight every corner through a local plan examination. They want to know that what is said in the arc is shared by the local authorities as well. And for Buckinghamshire's perspective, I hope they do come back into it, because if the Conservatives are in charge for the next few years and probably the next few years after that, then this is going to happen. So don't walk away, engage, take responsibility, set up your own, I can't remember, Dave, what you call them, citizens forum, assembly, whatever. Why don't each of the growth boards have their own citizens assembly, and they use that directly as a way of a voice for their local area? They don't need to be told to do that by government. They can do that now. There's nothing to stop them doing something like that. So a lot of this is about, local authorities taking responsibility. And I think the leadership group, from what I understand, is working really well, but it is a new relationship. And, my job is strategic planning, and I've always said, and Dave knows, it's about marriage guidance counselling. It's about bringing local authorities together who really don't know each other, don't know what to do, but they've got a shared and a sort of mutual benefit. They know that there's a reason why they have to do it, but they've never worked before. And Oxford, that area has never worked before. So there's some new relationships needing to be formed at that sort of local political level and officer level, it has to be said.
I wonder whether that proposition rather relies upon the authorities being married in the first place.
Wanting the marriage to survive.
Yeah.
I think that's true.
Yeah. Dave, do go on.
I mean, one further point that occurs to me, with this idea of citizens' assemblies, you can constitute them within the ARC. But I think one of the challenges is that if you do that at growth board level, each of those growth boards has its own agenda and its own patch. Really, the Oxcam ARC is an answer to a bigger set of questions for London and the wider Southeast as a whole. Perhaps you need central government to pose questions at that much, the kind of mega regional scale. If we're going to have housing at scale in the Southeast, then where is it best located? I take the point about the kind of local sensitivities and growth boards being more, sophisticated in that sense. But I do think we have to ask the biggest questions. Why do we need this kind of development? Why does it have to be here? What are the alternatives? Is this the best option? I tend to think we have to establish the principle, substantiate the principle of the ARC more firmly before we get into the slightly more mechanical questions of what is the legal setup, and is it more like RPG or RSS? I think we've got to take people forward with it and cultivate the idea, walking before we can run, maybe.
That's really interesting. So it's about the principle.
Yeah, and that is exactly how it works with regional spatial strategies. The regional assemblies did that first stage big thinking around different options, and then the sort of more local level plugged in behind that. That's exactly how it worked. It's that magical top down, bottom up approach. I think the geography for me, I always call it the Goldilocks principle. It can't be too big in order to capture the local sensitivities, but it can't be too small if it's going to deliver national scale priorities. It has to be at that sort of magic sort of strategic spatial geography that works for both.
But if we take too long dealing with that question, we just end up with cold porridge, don't we?
One of the things that I'm struggling with at the moment, maybe, I criticised I gave you the example of students who didn't do the reading. Maybe I'm falling into that category. But for me, at the moment, when I think of the ARC, and I ask myself, well, what does it involve? As I said before, in terms of real concrete proposals, it's the expressway and it's East-West Rail. it would be good if someone somewhere, presumably the government, actually sat down and was much more clear about precisely what it means in concrete terms. What is it that they want to deliver? Is it a series of new communities, new towns? Is it a series of infrastructure projects? And if so, what are they and where do they propose to go? So if they had a list of things they wanted to do, that would be a good starting point to then start some sort of public consultation, engagement, and saying to people, look, this is in your area, in your district, it means the following. It means the following roads, the following rail, the following amount of housing, the following amount of sort of business parks, whatever it may be, and explaining to the people in that district that this is part of a bigger picture. The reason we're proposing this for you is because it fits into a bigger picture, which will have benefits throughout throughout the whole area. And maybe Catriona knows the answer, or Dave knows the answer. Is there such a list out there that the government is working on? Is there something concrete in this spatial strategic framework about what it's going to mean in sort of concrete terms?
I think one of the other parts of strategic planning partnerships is honesty and transparency about what the objectives are. And I think government needs to, back to Dave's point about, is this really about providing a whole load of houses for the wider southeast to help meet the needs? Or is it about a green economy, leading green economy that is part of a global system and part of the national levelling up agenda to make Britain come out of the, for its sort of future resilience of its economy, and maybe it's a bit of both. But I do think government need to be honest about the housing element in this. They need to be very honest about, is this just about being able to provide more housing? Are they going to start from an objective around the economy? And then the other question they've got to ask is, back to my point about connectivity, I think physical connectivity probably meant an awful lot more a year ago than it does now. That issue around ratio between where people live and work is going to be a factor in a sort of post-COVID world, and with climate change and everything else. So is this about digital connectivity, and how does that impact on number of houses? So I think from my perspective, I think there's been a sea change from where it started with the National Infrastructure Commission's proposal, which was about a big shiny expressway and 1 million new homes, to where it's got now, which I think the leadership group of local authorities have had a huge amount of influence on. And they have worked really hard behind the scenes with government to get it to a position where it isn't just about the housing. But I do think there's an honesty from the government needed around what its objectives is. And if the partnership is going to work, then they all need to be honest about what they want out of it.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. I got out of this particular trio, which was the need to establish the concrete, well-chosen word, the concrete deliverables.
I think that's what the local people are afraid of.
the concrete deliverables, be that infrastructure, housing, or both. Secondly, a principle that is agreed upon amongst political bodies and organizations and people, which produces a vision. So principles and vision. And only then does one then have to tangle with the legal and policy structure and how it's to be applied, and what the particular architecture is for technical planning going forward. That's what I got out of all of that, and I found it fantastically helpful. And it to a degree, it vindicated my decision not to ask you right at the outset what the ARC is, because I think it's only at the end of that discussion that we've identified that the ARC has been one thing, is becoming another, and it's not actually certain what it will be, which is a fascinating position to be in after all of this time. But those contributions have been absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for organising it, Richard. Thank you.
What a fantastic sum up.
Well, it's never happened before. There we go. Let's see what happens.
Thank you very much.
And now, when you thought that was as much as you needed to know about the ARC, I want to introduce Daniel Francis from Carter Jonas and a report which his colleagues have put together in respect of what's happening in the ARC at the moment. He's going to introduce some of the numbers and what's happening in development terms in the Ark and compares it to what's happening outside of it. Good morning, Daniel.
Good morning. Very nice to be here.
Thank you. And thank you for Carter Jonas's report, which contains lots and lots of data about what's happening and what could happen in the Ark. What's that all about?
Well, we decided really to write the report because the Ark is now 18 years old. It's just had its 18th birthday of the concept, which was, it was originally launched in 2003 by three regional development agencies. And I suppose what we thought is, after all that time, it is really still a concept, because it's like it's an innovation corridor without the corridor. And I think now that there's sort of uncertainty over the transport links coming in, the original concept was based around road and rail. And of course, now the road element has effectively been cancelled, the western half of that road link. So it's really now reliant on the rail, although the kind of the western bit from Oxford to Milton Keynes is under construction. The eastern bit is, I guess, the more challenging section, because it relies on completely new infrastructure. And I think there's uncertainty inevitably there around when that's going to be delivered, particularly in the context of the levelling up agenda and so on. So although the government's made some good positive noises about that, there's always uncertainty until it's actually there. And of course, it's a really long-term concept that, putting in a new rail link. So we thought, well, let's take a step back and look at really what's the Ark supposed to be doing? Are there different ways we can think about particularly getting development in? Because the original concept was very much, around the transport link, providing a catalyst for development. So how can we think about the Ark a bit differently, in particular looking at sort of existing transport corridors and other places where development could go in?
And so absent the expressway and the rail link taking its time to, as I've said earlier, trundle in, you've done some work on existing transport corridors and looked at where the places to go might be. And you've been looking in particular, you've got all the data in respect of where the permissions are and where delivery has been taking place. And what were the broad conclusions that come from that?
Yes, well, I mean, we sort of tried to look at I guess, different possibilities about where you could develop. So, for example, there's some development can take place within existing city centres through, intensification and so on. So that's one option, but there's clearly a limit to how much that can happen, particularly given the historic nature of Oxford and Cambridge. Then we thought, well, you can then try and develop more in the sort of edge of town, out of town locations. But there, of course, you're coming up against the green belt as a major constraint to development. There are various other reasons why that's not necessarily so attractive, although I think there are clearly some very good business parks and science parks around Oxford and Cambridge, which do have the capacity to expand, and that's got great potential for agglomeration, particularly where some of these parks have sort of quite specialist occupiers. And so some of those have sort of planning pipelines, and there's good potential, and particularly the ones that are either sort of rail connected or the ones that have potential to be rail connected. So for example, Oxford Science Park could be connected via the Cowley branch line proposal into Oxford. So there are good opportunities there. Clearly, if you look at the east-west link that is proposed, there are possibilities for developments along that, particularly for residential development. If you look at locations like Sandy and Camborne and so on, there's potential there, but there's uncertainty about when that's going to be delivered. And really, those settlements are reliant on that rail link, because otherwise they're kind of risking becoming sort of dormitory towns with sort of poor transport access and clogging up local roads, and really not meeting, I think, the objectives of the Ark. So it seemed to us it was also quite good to look at what the existing transport corridors are that sort of emanate from the Ark, because there are a number of corridors which have already sort of really good transport connections to some of the UK's other major commercial centres.
And so this is your section 4, isn't it? The section 4 of your report looks at M4 corridor, particularly Oxford, Swindon, Bath, Bristol, M40 corridor, M1 corridor, M11, A1, and you've put together distance and travel time comparisons for each of those, both in terms of distance, drive time, and what happens if you manage to find a train line that works, and then looked at housing and commercial development along those corridors.
Yes, that's right. And it was really a way of trying to get a sense of the scale of opportunity along those corridors. And I mean, if you look at, for example, population growth forecasts, if you take the centres along the ARC corridor over the next 10 years, it's about a 5% increase in population. Whereas if you take the average across those corridors that you've outlined, forecasts are actually higher. They're more than 6% per annum. So there's already kind of more growth factored in there. You know, if you look at the housing stock, existing housing stock along those corridors, is kind of 8 times the scale of what you would find along the existing ARC corridor and so on. There's a lot of housing stock with planning in some of these locations, and some of these locations also do have a reasonable pipeline of office stock as well. You know, there's a lot of potential if you look along those corridors. They've got an existing transport connection. Now, in some cases, that transport connection needs to be improved. That's much easier to do where you've got an existing rail infrastructure or road infrastructure that can be upgraded, rather than trying to do what the ARC is trying to do and effectively build an entirely new rail line which will connect Milton Keynes with Cambridge. So it's really about, you know, can you upgrade the existing infrastructure where it's maybe not good enough to take advantage of connecting the ARC locations to some of these other major cities. You know, in a way, Oxford and Cambridge are, you know, they're a long way apart. In a lot of ways, they're competitors to each other. And if you're in Oxford, whilst it sounds great to be able to connect to Cambridge, it's also pretty good if you can improve connections to Bristol, which after all, has, a great university and a lot of great skills, and also to Birmingham, which has great universities, great highly skilled workforce. And then if you look at sort of locations sort of on the route, places like Banbury, for example, there's, clearly already a lot of distribution development going in around Banbury. Is there perhaps potential for sort of more residential development to go in those kinds of locations? Our report hasn't gone into the detail of looking at what's the potential in specific locations, but it's really the principle that you've got these existing corridors which connect the main ARC centres with really good commercial centres which have a lot to offer in themselves, and got the potential of putting in perhaps additional residential developments along those corridors, which have the potential to supply places along the ARC corridor with the additional skilled labour that I guess they need.
The conclusion which you have in the report is that presently there's no magic bullet to enable growth, but there is significant potential to provide development along the existing transport corridors to ARC locations. And it's really what your report highlights is that those synergies exist and provide interim development opportunities while the ARC's journey itself continues and hopefully crystallizes sooner rather than later. But what you're saying is there's real potential using the existing infrastructure.
Yes, that's exactly right. The ARC has done very, very well economically. The individual locations performed extremely well without the actual ARC concepts and the infrastructure going in. So it's a high growth area already, but we see development as really one of the major constraints for that continuing, both on the residential and the commercial side. I don't think all the changes around COVID really affect that. And indeed, if you look at the commercial markets in Oxford and Cambridge, particularly around the science parks, there is insatiable demand from occupiers and investors as well, to buy into those locations. There's incredibly strong demand for occupiers to occupy, particularly high tech space, and it's the provision of that kind of space which we see is particularly important in these locations. But I think that the solution will come from a variety of places. It's partly about, as I said, intensification in city centres and change of use. Loads of opportunity now for change of use, particularly with all the changes going on in the sort of the high street retail sector, and perhaps some sectors not demanding as much office space going forward. So there's lots of potential there. There's potential, as I said, around the business parks, which will form part of it. particularly getting more capacity for lab space, high-tech space. But there's also this I think massive potential for development along existing corridors and to better connect the key ARC locations with other cities as well.
Well, Daniel, enormous thanks to you and to your research team for putting together the report, which does fill the gap as to what's possible now. You use the word potential there, emphasising what can be achieved. Will indicate where the report can be found in the text alongside the podcast. But in the meantime, as I say, thank you very much indeed, and it's been a real pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That was the planning podcast from Number 5 Chambers. Next, we turn to the long local plan examination and to Wales. We look forward to seeing and hearing from you then. Until then, stay safe and goodbye.